I'd been married to James Wilson for 10 years when he finally fell into the cliché of keeping a mistress. The mistress stood before me with her head held high, berating me for being childless yet clinging to the position of Mrs. Wilson. She questioned how I could watch James's business empire go without an heir, and whether that weighed on my conscience. Her arrogant accusations jolted me awake. I looked at her coldly, asking if she had done her research when pursuing him, if she even knew that he had married into my family and taken my surname. Every Wednesday at 3 p.m, I have my afternoon tea at the Ritz-Carlton. This Wednesday was no different. I ordered my usual pastries and fruit tea when a young woman sat nearby. After ordering, she spoke in a sweet voice to the server, requesting a slice of Napoleon cake to take home, saying her husband absolutely loved it. The server apologetically informed her that the Napoleon cake had been very popular that day, with the last piece already reserved for me. She then approached my table and sat across from me, sweetly asking if I would mind letting her have the Napoleon cake, explaining that her husband only enjoyed the ones from this hotel. I smiled at the coincidence, telling her that my husband also loved their Napoleon cake. To make up for taking her favorite, I offered to treat her to afternoon tea as an apology. She was much younger than me, with a sweet and polite demeanor that I found quite appealing. I didn't mind having company for tea. She even added me on Instagram, promising to reciprocate my treat next time. She proved to be quite talkative. Throughout the afternoon, she shared that her name was Sarah Miller, spoke of her doting husband, and mentioned she was 3 months pregnant. I couldn't help but notice how her husband's preferences, sweets, golf, and swimming, coincidentally matched James's. As she sipped her cranberry juice, with a plate of pregnancy vitamins beside her, she shared her complaints about her husband's insistence on organic supplements for the baby's sake. She found it amusing how he claimed it would give the baby perfect skin, questioning what men really knew about such things, though she seemed fond of his constant fussing. She went on to tell me about how one night, despite never eating street food himself, he went out to satisfy her pregnancy craving, even trying some himself. She spoke of her increasingly picky appetite, expressing gratitude for his patience. Watching her radiate such happiness as she spoke made me smile too, though I didn't yet know the bitter irony behind that smile. She looked so happy, it made me smile too. Touching her belly, she looked at me with uncertainty, expressing her worry that I might find her dramatic. She confessed her nervousness about being a first-time mother, asking me not to laugh at her cluelessness. I assured her it was fine, admitting that I knew nothing about motherhood either, as I'd never had children. She covered her mouth in surprise, questioning if my childlessness was by choice. I chose to remain silent, letting the question hang in the air. Her mood quickly shifted as she caressed her belly, beaming with happiness while sharing her dreams. She spoke of her husband's successful business and her desire to give him a son to inherit his empire. I responded with calculated casualness, merely noting that her husband must be very fortunate. After tea, we walked out together. I had just settled into my car when I noticed Sarah getting into a waiting vehicle ahead. That car. I knew it well. My eyes narrowed. If my contact lenses weren't deceiving me, that was my husband James's car. My heart sank lower and lower. Before getting in, Sarah glanced back at my car. In that moment, I realized nothing had been coincidental, this had been a carefully orchestrated scene. After 10 years of marriage, James had finally fallen into the cliché of keeping a mistress, and quite an interesting one at that. I'd grown up sitting on my grandfather's knee, listening to him conduct business meetings and make executive decisions. The art of business warfare was in my blood. The cardinal rule, never alert your prey. That evening at home, James noticed the hotel logo on the Napoleon cake box from the fridge and hesitated. While eating the cake, he attempted casual conversation, asking if I'd been to the Ritz that day. I nodded, reminding him that I went every Wednesday, as he well knew. When he pressed about whether I'd met anyone interesting, I feigned puzzlement, dismissing it as just the usual ladies who lunch, gossiping about things that didn't interest me. James moved closer, taking my hand and suggesting we hadn't been on vacation in a while. He proposed taking some time off, mentioning the diving trip I'd always wanted. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up, my body's instinctive response to his calculated performance. I opened Instagram and checked Sarah's profile. Sure enough, hubby forgives baby's midnight cravings. Right now we're craving candied pecans. Half an hour later, she posted an update, a small dish filled with perfectly shelled pecans. There was also a short video showing a man's hands, carefully cracking the nuts with a nutcracker. Those hands. I knew them well. An hour ago, they had been holding mine, speaking sweet nothings. I used to love pecans too, but always found them tedious to shell. James would crack them for me, insisting they were good for my health. That kind of exclusive devotion I had at once. When did it slip away? Come morning, James returned in workout clothes, claiming he'd been for a morning run. He leaned down to kiss me, morning, sleepyhead. I bought those croissants you love from that French bakery. Better eat them while they're warm. James probably didn't realize he still carried another woman's perfume nauseating this early in the morning. How times change. I'd long since lost my taste for croissants, finding them too rich. Much like James, I'd lost my taste for him too. Sarah's Instagram kept updating. Her morning inspiration post, hubby says a good breakfast means a smart baby. The photo showed imported cherries, fresh sweet corn, and perfectly poached eggs with a sprinkle of sea salt. Happiness oozed from every pixel. I propped my head up, reflecting, Elizabeth Anderson, you've grown far too comfortable. How did you miss your husband managing 2 households? I suppose I was too confident in having all of James's love. After James left for work, I had Sarah's complete background on my desk before noon. Sarah Miller, hired as a receptionist at Anderson Corporation right after college. Her striking beauty and sweet smile caught James's attention. Later, he discovered she was an orphan who'd put herself through college with student loans, still working part-time to pay them off. Hardworking and determined. One day, after her morning shift at a cafe, she fainted from low blood sugar in front of James's car, having missed breakfast. James, moved by compassion, transferred her to work as his assistant. What followed was inevitable. Her determination, her beauty, her careful timidity, everything about her would move a man like James to protect her. He set her up in the most expensive riverside villa, planted her favorite peonies in the garden, and even assigned his most discreet driver, Tom, who'd been with him for years, to ensure her safety. While I took my sleeping pills each night, he would visit his little love nest. Sometimes he'd stay the night, returning home in fresh workout clothes, claiming he'd been for a morning run. He juggled both lives masterfully, just like his business dealings, seamless and perfect. A few thin papers told the whole story of James's callousness. After marriage, I couldn't conceive. Depressed, James had said, "It's okay, we'll get checked out together. If we can have children, great. If not, isn't our life together sweet enough? Why do we need a third wheel?" When the test results came back, I knew I could never have children. I locked the report in our home safe, burying it away. It was Dad's 60th birthday celebration, with many business associates and family friends in attendance. James and I stayed close to my parents, listening to them reminisce with old friends. Throughout the evening, I noticed James's phone buzzing constantly, his attention growing increasingly scattered. When I quietly inquired about a possible work emergency, he frowned and explained about a difficult client and troublesome contract revisions. He quickly added that nothing was more important than Dad's birthday, but his distraction was evident in every movement. He even mistakenly poured me red wine instead of white. Watching his growing unease, I suggested he should leave, noting that Dad would soon notice his unusual behavior. I observed how he tensed at my words before quickly masking it, choosing instead to stay through the entire celebration and birthday cake. His distraction became dangerous on the drive home when he nearly ran a red light. As I stepped out of the car, I studied his anxious expression, commenting on how urgent the matter must be if it couldn't wait until morning. I watched him hesitate before claiming he'd feel better checking on it tonight. My response was deliberately measured as I told him to be sure he knew what he was doing, reminding him that his position hadn't been easily earned. Each word was carefully chosen, letting him wonder just how much I knew. The evening seemed to unsettle him. After that, I noticed James became more cautious, reducing his outings after I took my sleeping pills. My daily check of Sarah's Instagram revealed today's post, 4D ultrasound today. Mommy and Daddy get to see what you look like. The hospital's location was no mystery to me. My investigation report had documented every prenatal appointment with meticulous detail. I orchestrated my next move carefully, positioning myself with a friend around the corner from the ultrasound room, timing our conversation to be just audible as James helped Sarah out. Every detail was calculated, every word meant to be overheard. I caught James dropping Sarah's arm from the corner of my eye, pretending not to know her as he hurried toward me. I feigned surprise upon seeing James, asking with calculated innocence what brought him to the hospital. His concern seemed genuine as he questioned why I hadn't told him about feeling unwell or asked him to accompany me. I maintained my casual demeanor, explaining I was simply getting a prescription refilled and had bumped into Kate. I felt James tense beside me as Sarah walked past, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. His eyes betrayed a flash of panic that he couldn't quite hide. Seizing the moment, I leaned closer to him, playfully questioning his nervousness and suggesting he must have done something naughty. I made a show of looking around, noting we were in the maternity ward, before teasingly suggesting he might have gotten someone pregnant. His response was telling: wild-eyed denial and a hurried explanation about hearing from a friend who claimed to have seen someone resembling me here. I didn't miss Sarah's venomous glare as she passed. I orchestrated the next moment carefully, pretending to just notice Sarah's presence. With deliberate casualness, I introduced them, reminding everyone of our afternoon tea encounter and the coincidence of our husband's shared love for Napoleon cake. Each word was chosen to tighten the noose. My final twist of the knife came as I commented on her husband's absence, expressing concern about his supposed attentiveness while suggesting a future double date. I watched as my words hit their mark. Sarah's face froze before she fled in tears, while James's expression crumbled into a mixture of anxiety and despair. The next day's meeting request from Sarah came as expected. Once again at the Ritz-Carlton, she sat across from me in her maternity dress, supporting her back. Her direct gaze carried an accusation as she stated that I must now know her true identity. I met her challenge head-on, questioning whether this elaborate performance wasn't exactly what she had wanted, my discovery of their affair. Her response was predictably defensive as she touched her belly, claiming she had no choice with the baby's impending arrival and her desire for legitimacy. Sarah lifted her pretty young face, already glowing with impending motherhood. She began lecturing me about how a successful man like James remained childless, questioning how I could cling to the position of Mrs. Wilson despite my inability to bear children. She spoke of James's desire for his child to have legitimacy, his wish to give his son a proper birthright. With youthful arrogance, she suggested I was past my prime and should know when to step aside. I couldn't help but laugh behind my hand at her naivety. I questioned whether she'd done any research about the man she was pursuing, pointing out that James had married into my family. I watched her expression change as I mentioned Anderson Corporation, deliberately letting the implications sink in. With calculated precision, I asked if her benefactor knew about our meeting, wondering aloud what would anger him more, her presumption or fear of my reaction. Someone must have alerted James, for he appeared suddenly at our table. The way his eyes fixed on me, completely ignoring Sarah's presence and her hurt expression, told its own story. His voice trembled as he asked me to go home. Despite my efforts to maintain composure, seeing him made my heart ache. As I stood, I noticed my hands shaking while gathering my belongings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Elizabeth Anderson, only daughter of Anderson Corp., raised like royalty and always above it all, now reduced to confronting her husband's mistress. When James reached out to steady me, I shot him a look cold enough to make him withdraw his hand. Sarah, however, wasn't finished. She grabbed his arm desperately, her eyes pleading as she reminded him about their soon-to-be-born child and his promises about their son's place in society. Her words grew more venomous as she attacked me for my childlessness, questioning my right to hold on to James, suggesting my only claim was money and an inflated sense of superiority. Each word she spoke pushed me closer to my breaking point. The sound of my palm striking James's face echoed through the room. Sarah's gasp of outrage and her protest at my actions barely registered. James's sharp rebuke to her, demanding to know why she'd harassed me despite his warnings to stay away, only fueled her defiance. Sarah's challenge was direct. She called James indecisive, claiming she was helping him face reality. Her taunt about my supposed power, suggesting I should strike her instead, only resulted in another resounding slap across James's face. I turned my gaze to both of them, coldly informing Sarah that each word from her mouth would earn James another slap. I explained with icy clarity that while she meant nothing to me, James was my husband, and he would bear the punishment for his mistakes. James's eyes were red as he pleaded with me to go home. During the drive, I could only bite my lip and stare out the window, knowing that speaking would likely make me physically ill. The image of James standing beside Sarah had made everything brutally real. The betrayal of our marriage was no longer just a suspicion. His explanations came in waves. He spoke of initially feeling sorry for her, seeing her work multiple jobs, and fainting from exhaustion. He claimed she reminded him of his younger self. His voice grew softer as he described helping her get a better job and providing her a place to live, insisting he thought that would be the end of it. The story continued: a gratitude dinner, too much alcohol, and then the pregnancy from what he claimed was just one encounter. He insisted he'd wanted to tell me, but feared causing me pain, and couldn't abandon his responsibility once Sarah became pregnant. His words made me physically ill. I rushed to the bathroom, violently sick. When he tried to help me, I recoiled from his touch, telling him not to touch me with hands that had caressed her. I watched his face go ashen as I told him how disgusting he'd become to me. The reality of the situation made all his explanations seem like hollow jokes. I pulled up Sarah's Instagram feed and threw my phone at him, demanding to know how he'd managed his time so perfectly for an entire year, visiting her after I took my sleeping pills, yet still bringing me breakfast each morning. My words grew more bitter as I dissected his excuses. His claims of feeling sorry for her had resulted in giving her the most expensive riverside villa. His supposed pity for her multiple jobs and low blood sugar had led to him cooking for her daily in their love nest. His fear of hurting me hadn't stopped him from spending every day with another woman, apparently seeing no difference between one transgression and 100. James lowered his head before looking up with reddened eyes. His words came out as if each one caused him physical pain, confessing that while he knew he was wrong, he truly didn't love Sarah. He spoke of feeling inadequate around me, of how everyone saw him merely as Elizabeth Anderson's husband, crediting his success to me. His voice grew softer as he described how Sarah had appeared in his life, worshipping him and feeding his vanity with her admiration. He insisted that I was his only love, trying to diminish his affair as a minor deviation rather than the main theme of his life. I felt despair washing over me as I questioned his logic. Did he really believe physical betrayal didn't count as long as his heart remained supposedly faithful? Did he think that made it forgivable? The weight of our 10 years together pressed down on me as I reminded him how I had stepped back, quietly supporting him and letting him take control of Anderson Corporation. I wondered aloud if that time hadn't been enough to build his confidence, realizing his insecurity ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. The bitter question escaped me: did my marriage have to pay the price for his inferiority complex? His response only proved my point. He noted my composure, how I maintained control even in the face of his infidelity, without screaming or crying. The irony of his criticism wasn't lost on me. I wanted to cry, but my eyes felt dry and burning as I reminded him that he had known about my background from the start. Every step from courtship to marriage had been his choice. He had no right to push his mistakes onto me or abandon his dignity. Memories flooded back unbidden. I remembered him in his freshman year, having lost his parents in a car accident, working his way through college. I had fallen for his determination and thoughtfulness. Now those beautiful young memories felt tainted, corrupted by his betrayal. Looking at this familiar stranger before me, my heart felt as if it were filled with bitter lemons. The pain was sharper knowing that he had understood exactly what he was destroying. He knew how much I loved him, knew my stubborn nature, knew how deeply his betrayal would wound me. Yet he had chosen to do it anyway. Like scenes from a movie, memories played through my mind, him waiting outside my dorm with roasted chestnuts, secretly slipping hand warmers into my coat during winter classes, our embrace when he proposed, our happy smiles at our wedding. Each precious memory now felt like a knife twisting in my heart. As tears finally streamed down my face, I made my decision. I told him we should get divorced. His immediate objection was predictable, but it changed nothing. His eyes were red with frustration as he protested, his voice rising with desperation. He kept insisting it was just one mistake that he'd already admitted to, reminding me of his decade of supposed devotion. His pleas for forgiveness came wrapped in excuses about being just a normal man, claiming that the perfect person I wanted didn't exist. I pulled my hand from his desperate grip, delivering the truth that cut us both. The perfect person I had loved was him, but that person no longer existed. Our divorce became the talk of the city. That night, I made my decision final by throwing a suitcase at him and demanding he leave. My resolve was absolute. In the days that followed, James began his campaign of atonement. Every morning without fail, he would bring breakfast to my door. I never opened it, so he would leave the food outside along with a bouquet of flowers. This routine continued through rain and shine, 3 meals every day, until even the security guard began to sympathize with him. The guard would try to intercede on James's behalf when I passed through the lobby, suggesting that young couples' fights always blow over, praising James's dedication in trying to win me back. I maintained my silence, knowing what they didn't, that James wasn't just making deliveries to my door. He was also visiting Sarah's place. I had purposely kept Sarah's Instagram unblocked, watching her updates like a form of self-inflicted punishment. Her latest post felt like a deliberate taunt, photos of a nursery with the caption, "This is the little prince's kingdom that mommy and daddy prepared. We can't wait to welcome you." The nursery was beautiful, every detail carefully chosen and arranged, a clear testament to the parents' joyful anticipation. Looking at those images, my eyes began to sting with tears, not for their happiness, but for my own loss. The pain cut deeper because I had always dreamed of being a mother, of having my own child. But that chance had never come my way, making their display of domestic bliss feel like a particularly cruel twist of fate. The irony of him flaunting his future heir was almost laughable. When news of the divorce reached my parents, Dad's concern was evident in his simple question about my certainty. My response came with a bitter smile, asking him if he would eat something already rotted. His answer was to find the best divorce attorney to draft our settlement agreement. As I began auditing our marital assets, the lawyer's findings left me stunned. In just 1 year, beyond the $1 million villa, James had lavished hundreds of thousands on Sarah. Our arrival at the Riverside Villa brought its own drama. Sarah opened the door with a familiar sweetness, calling out to what she thought was James returning. Her welcoming smile froze upon seeing me, quickly informing me that James wasn't home. I brushed past her, taking in the gaudy decor with distaste. My purpose was clear. I informed her that I was selling the house, and she had merely half a day to pack and leave before the realtor collected the keys. Her fury erupted immediately. She insisted the house was James's gift to her, claiming I had no right to evict her. The lawyer stepped in, explaining with professional detachment that as marital property, the house was subject to my claim, regardless of James's unauthorized gifting. I added the final twist, demanding she leave behind all the jewelry James had given her for inventory. Her response was predictable, an immediate call to James, her voice dripping with manufactured distress about being evicted and the baby supposedly kicking. After hanging up, her demeanor shifted to smug satisfaction as she informed me James was on his way. She couldn't resist adding her thoughts about men disliking domineering women, finding my self-righteous attitude repulsive. Her performance grew more theatrical as she paraded around, caressing her belly and cooing to her unborn child about daddy coming home. Her words became increasingly pointed, describing this as her home with James, his sanctuary away from the cold, loveless Anderson estate. Her final barb was aimed directly at my core, a lecture about men preferring gentle women, suggesting that all my money meant nothing when paired with my controlling nature, ending with the prediction that men would always leave someone like me. Sarah's diatribe continued as she lectured about bitter old wives who blame other women instead of examining their own failures. Her words dripped with contempt as she questioned my ability to keep my husband's heart, suggesting that if I had been good enough, James wouldn't have strayed. She mocked my supposed lack of dignity in coming here, questioning why I would keep James trapped if I was truly as superior as I acted. Her practiced mistress rhetoric was truly enlightening in its audacity. The dynamic shifted instantly when James appeared at the door. Sarah transformed, throwing herself into his arms with theatrical tears, claiming I was being horrible and that the baby was distressed. James's immediate response was to defend her, telling me to leave Sarah out of our issues. The pain was physical, like needles stabbing into my heart, making each breath a struggle. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady myself. I should have been prepared for this scene, but watching James protect her made me realize the true depth of my wound. With forced composure, I acknowledged the revelation that our home had apparently disgusted him so much, that his hatred for me ran so deep. I questioned why he wouldn't agree to divorce then, allowing us both to move forward. My sarcastic smile as I glanced at Sarah's belly carried all my bitterness as I reminded him about legitimacy concerns for his business empire's heir. James's discomfort at my directness only fueled my response. I challenged their hypocrisy in finding my words harsh, while seeing nothing shameful in their affair. His insistence that he wouldn't agree to divorce or leave me rang hollow. My bitter laughter filled the room as I called out his shameless use of Anderson money to support his mistress, questioning if he planned to use it for their child as well. His resignation from Anderson Corp came as no surprise. He acknowledged my father's influence and his own powerlessness against it. I reminded him of the simple truth: he shouldn't try to have everything, especially things that weren't rightfully his. His desperate grab for my hand came with pleas to start over, promises to never see Sarah again, claims that we didn't need children. Sarah's pale-faced screams about abandonment provided a dramatic backdrop to this scene. My response was brutally honest. I told him reconciliation was impossible, that he disgusted me, that his touch made me physically ill knowing where those hands had been. I stepped back, both physically and emotionally, telling him to end things cleanly, making it clear that true care for our relationship made his betrayal unforgivable. The sight of James releasing my hand, his head lowered and eyes reddened, brought no satisfaction, only a deep, resonating finality. Our asset division proved surprisingly simple. The Anderson Corp shares remained safely in my father's hands, beyond James's reach. We only needed to split our marital assets and properties. James's only request was the riverside villa. He declined any money, his voice quiet and resigned as he reflected on how having my love for 10 years had been enough. He acknowledged his regrets, though we both knew it was too late for such sentiments. As I signed the divorce papers, I decided to leave him with one final gesture. I handed him a yellowed envelope, calling it a parting gift, to mark the end of our marriage. Without waiting for his reaction, I turned and left. That envelope contained a 7-year-old medical report, the diagnosis of James's varicocele, that had rendered him infertile. The truth I had carefully guarded since our early marriage, when our attempts to conceive led us to medical testing. Upon receiving those results, I had made the choice to protect his dignity by concealing his condition, allowing him to believe I was the infertile one. I had maintained this facade for years, letting everyone, including my parents, believe their daughter was barren. I watched as they felt guilty toward James, treating him like their own son, all while carrying this secret. What a waste it all seemed now. The timing of revealing this 7-year-old diagnosis felt appropriate, a final truth to accompany our divorce. James's call came as expected, his devastation evident in his hoarse voice. He struggled to understand why I had hidden this truth, why I had let everyone, even my parents, believe I was the one who couldn't have children. His disbelief was palpable through the phone. After a moment's contemplation, I explained my past self's motivations in the third person, how Elizabeth Anderson had loved James Wilson so deeply that she prioritized his happiness and peace of mind over everything else, choosing to shoulder the burden alone rather than let him feel any pressure or unhappiness. His voice cracked as he acknowledged his own twisted logic, how he had used what he thought was my infertility as justification, believing it meant I owed him forgiveness even for his infidelity. The realization that I had been protecting him all along seemed to break something in him. In the aftermath of the divorce, I found solace in work, immersing myself in the familiar routines of running the company. It was easier than dwelling on the past. Sarah's arrival was as dramatic as ever, her pregnant belly prominent and her face haggard with distress. The moment she saw me, her composure shattered. She launched into an accusatory tirade, questioning why I was playing games despite the divorce, suggesting I was keeping James from returning home while pretending to accept our separation. Her hatred for what she called my fakeness was palpable. I observed her outburst with detachment, simply stating that I had no contact with James. But her attention caught on the fresh roses adorning my windowsill, my favorites, accompanied by a small card reading, "To Beth, be happy. James." These daily flowers had become such a mundane occurrence that I barely noticed them anymore. The receptionist simply brought them in, and I couldn't be bothered to dispose of them. Yet their presence seemed to wound Sarah deeply. Her reaction was visceral. She tore down the flowers in a fit of rage, smashing them to the ground while accusing me of still seducing James. As she crushed the blooms beneath her feet, I found myself studying her prominent belly, realizing that James must have discovered the truth about the child's paternity. It would explain his sudden avoidance of her. With calculated innocence, I questioned why she and James weren't married yet, reminding her of his promises about legitimacy and inheritance for their soon-to-be-born child. Her response was telling. She collapsed into a chair, touching her belly as she admitted that James had become unreachable, avoiding her calls and disappearing from their shared home. The irony of her situation struck me as darkly amusing. Here she was, seeking help from the very woman whose marriage she had destroyed. Through her tears, she revealed her confusion about how everything had unraveled, recounting James's promises of marriage after our divorce, his declarations of love, his assurances of providing a home for her and their supposed son. As I called security, I delivered my final words to her with cold precision. I reminded her that she had made her own choices in destroying my marriage and family, that she had fought for what she wanted, and these were the consequences of her decisions. My parting suggestion that she think carefully about her next move carried a weight of warning that even she couldn't miss. Though James never returned to Sarah, his messages to me continued daily. His words cycled through various stages of regret, apologizing for my years of silent suffering, questioning my decision to shoulder his infertility alone, lamenting his loss of me, begging forgiveness, and desperately seeking another chance. Eventually, I blocked his number, weary of these hollow sentiments. His professional life after leaving Anderson Corp became a series of false starts. Sarah's dramatic appearances at each new workplace effectively sabotaged every opportunity. She would arrive, heavily pregnant, creating public scenes about his alleged abandonment of their family and unborn child. These performances inevitably led to his dismissal as companies sought to avoid controversy. James initially maintained his silence in the face of these disruptions, but his patience finally shattered. In front of a stunned audience, he exploded with the truth: he was physically incapable of fathering children. His outburst exposed the secret I had protected for so long, explaining the mystery of our childless decade of marriage. Sarah's reaction to this revelation was immediate, her face drained of color as she desperately insisted on the child's paternity. James's response was brutal in its directness. He laughed bitterly, referencing her past work at the bar, her drinking with customers, suggesting the real father could be any number of men from those encounters. His cruel words seemed to physically wound Sarah. She clutched at her chest, stumbling backward in denial, insisting he was fabricating excuses to escape responsibility. In her distressed retreat, she missed a step. Though nearby observers prevented her fall, the shock of the confrontation triggered early labor. The truth became undeniable when she delivered a premature son whose features, flat nose, narrow eyes, bore no resemblance to Sarah's, instead presumably matching those of his unknown biological father. The reality of this situation finally broke Sarah's carefully constructed facade. Her breakdown was complete, leaving her to face the consequences of her deceptions. James never appeared at the hospital. After discharge, Sarah took to sitting outside the riverside villa with her newborn, her desperate cries echoing through the neighborhood. Her proclamations grew increasingly frantic, insisting the child was James's, threatening suicide if they weren't acknowledged, claiming her status as Mrs. Wilson, and pathetically repeating James's empty promises about her supposed purity and innocence. I found myself playing the role of Good Samaritan one final time. Through my connections, I uncovered the truth about her child's conception a night when she had passed out drunk in the bar's back alley, and a bartender had taken her home. The photos left no room for doubt. The genetic resemblance between the child and the bartender was undeniable. I ensured this information reached the bartender's ears. He proved to be a decent man whose only obstacle to marriage had been financial. Now, presented with a ready-made family, his path became clear. Sarah had barely left the hospital when his family arrived, insisting on marriage. Within days, she and the baby disappeared to his small hometown. The scandal consumed our city's social circles, where James had been a minor celebrity. The revelation of his infertility spread rapidly, each retelling more sensational than the last. The humiliation drove him into seclusion. Ironically, my reputation soared. People praised my loyalty, marveling at my willingness to shoulder blame for my spouse. My father received congratulations from his peers on raising such an admirable daughter. This newfound admiration apparently made me quite the catch. Suitors began appearing with amusing regularity. Our paths didn't cross again until my top 10 business leaders award ceremony. As I gave interviews to local news, I spotted him in the crowded hall, a shadow of his former self, haggard and defeated. He raised his glass in a silent toast, then set it down and slipped away into the crowd. Word reached me that his new company had gone bankrupt, but such news no longer held any significance in my life. When the next reporter approached, I simply turned and offered my professional smile, ready to discuss the future rather than dwell on the past.